Can you hear me? All right. So I'll begin with saying that what this debate doesn't represent my personal beliefs, but with that being said, I affirm the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. According to Oxford English Dictionary, ought is used to indicate duty or correctness, and reparations are the making of amends for a wrong one has done, by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have wronged. Contention 1, a wrong has been committed. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, 42% of the homeless population is African American, when they only make up 13% of the general population. Furthermore, in the U.S., over twice as many Black families live in poverty than white. Black families are more likely than any other race to live in poverty, according to the United States Census Bureau. To include all stolen income from the Revolution to secession, the balance falls deep into the red. In 1860, translated to today's terms, slaves represent a staggering $10 trillion in wealth, an incredible sum. The work that slaves had to do should be compensated for, and by forcing them to work for free, trillions of dollars were outrageously stolen from the entire African American society. Thus, it is our duty to be able to provide African Americans with at least a portion of the money that was stolen from them. Additionally, according to Atlanta Black Star, many major U.S. corporations have benefited financially from slavery, including Lehman Brothers, Aetna, JP Morgan Chase, and Wachovia, all of whom released formal apologies in the early 2000s but did not pay reparations. My second contention is that paying reparations solves the problems of mistreatment of African Americans by the U.S. federal government. Resources to predominantly African American schools is an effective form of reparation. Empirically, out of 10 studies, 9 were shown to positively benefit African Americans, and only 1 of the 10 found no visible change. Paying reparations will have a beneficial impact. Reparations generate discourse on race issues that have been neglected by the majority of the public, which encourages people to learn more about race issues and work towards social change. According to the Huffington Post, a majority of white people surveyed said racism is not an issue in their own community, while acknowledging that racism is a problem in the United States. However, according to the Rutgers Law Review, discourse has reached a level of unprecedented productivity because of proposals for reparations. Finally, according to Professor Malefi Asante of Temple University, discourse about reparations will advance the civil rights agenda, which is beneficial for the United States' goal of equality in the long term. My third contention is the precedent of the United States federal government paying various abused groups. According to the National Public Radio in 1998, the U.S. federal government gave over 10,000 Japanese Americans reparations, and there are also several reparations that were given to Native Americans throughout history. With that in mind, I believe that giving reparations to African Americans is the most effective way to generate discourse and improve their standing in society. Thus, I affirm.
Hey, thank you so much for this debate. I'd like to thank everybody at QallOut. I would like to thank for us being battling for third position. So I'm going to start off with my case before I go into refutations and rebuttals. So the U.S. federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. I agree with your definitions for the most part. I'm going to start off with a quote. It's up from slavery. Former slave Booker T. Washington wrote, "Slavery, having once gotten its tentacles fastened onto the economic and social life of the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. Then, when we rid ourselves of prejudice or racial feeling and look facts in the face, we must acknowledge that notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country who themselves or whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery are in a stronger and more hopeful condition materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously than is true of an equal member of the Black people in any other portion of the globe." Case preview. 3 contentions. 1, moral argument. 2, reparations would cause an increase in poverty. 3, the backlash from reparations will hurt African Americans. First one, moral argument. The crime indicts the American people themselves at every level and in nearly every configuration. A crime that implicates the entire American people. Is there a moral obligation for current Americans to pay reparations for past sins? No, there is a moral wrong here to make innocent people pay for the sins of the father. Here is why. A, America fought a civil war with respect to slavery. That price has been paid in the blood of thousands of men, women, and children. B, most Americans for many generations have all over disavowed slavery as an immoral action. C, the actual amount that could possibly be paid with respect to enslaving someone is an immeasurable price and not one that any current generation can afford to pay the just fee. D, it would be an arbitrary designation to a single generation of African Americans who arguably do not suffer the full harms of slavery. There is also the issue of paying an equal amount per person, or would it be based on the individual's current income level? Also, is there a distinct genetic ratio that might have give different groups within that community? Impact. Two wrongs do not make a right. Confiscating wealth from others to give someone else based on arguably faulty assertions is an immoral action. The world does not get better by continuing constant immoral actions built on revenge or false justice.
All right, so I'm going to first respond to that contention. So what you first started with is that the crime indicts the American people. And what the argument here today is whether or not the U.S. federal government is responsible. I think the best example is healthcare. As of right now, there's people who pay for healthcare who don't end up getting sick. But I myself didn't personally get someone else sick. Why am I paying healthcare? Well, the reason is because it's a general American good that we provide healthcare to our citizens. And in this case, the reason that we're providing it is not because we're fixing a wrong of slavery, is because unfairly African Americans have less of an opportunity in society right now. I believe the justification doesn't root back to slavery, although I do believe that's where it began. But I would argue that currently in society, the reason why we ought to pay reparations is because African Americans are not granted equal opportunity. Then you brought up this argument about implementation. Now, it would be very hard to justify an implementation for reparations because it's frankly hard to trace back the people. But I were to say that it's not my job as the affirmative to prove an implementation, but even if I were to do that, I would say the most effective way is to provide vouchers to students in schools so they're able to get a better education, have more access to resources. And in terms of adults, the number one problem is that they're discriminated in the housing industry. I would say that providing African Americans more monetary wealth so that they're able to improve their housing situation is the most effective way to go about this. But I don't believe this debate should come down to implementation. So going off the idea of the moral argument, I think what's important to understand about paying reparations itself is that the reason we're doing this is, again, because of the current societal standing of African Americans. We have to ensure that they have the equal opportunities to those of Americans. And according to Randall Robinson, writing for the New York Times, he says, labor has an economic value whose balance sheet measure does not disappear behind the shadow of time. The enslaved, still yet compensated labor has a fair market value that, once measured, should be paid to all the descendants of those who built America. And the Associated Press said theft of black-owned land stretching back to the antebellum period documented some 406 victims and 24,000 acres of land valued at tens of millions of dollars. The land was taken through means from raging of legal terrorism. And because of the fact that because back in the time there was a bill vetoed that actually gave back the land to the African Americans, the United States federal government is legally obligated to make an amends for a wrong they have committed. So because of the fact that we took land from the African Americans and we never justified this wrong, we're legally obligated, and the US federal government has to act. Whether or not that's coming from the people is a subsequent factor. But because the government is obligated and must adhere to the Constitution, it's for that reason that I believe that we ought to pay these reparations.
Okay, so I'm going to move into my second contention. Reparations for slavery would increase poverty. So this is going to be a turn on his on one of his. So I just want to make that clear. So Alpha, the state as of right now already provides a safety net and securities for vulnerable communities, which are much better at having a steady path to get out of poverty. Giving people huge sums of money has very negative impacts on long-term growth. Bravo. Forbes, Kyle Smith notes the reparations plans that have been suggested, however, would look a lot like lotteries. And that suggests a large sum of money distributed to a single generation over a period of a decade or two. Now, the affirmative hasn't given a plan, but what plan they did isn't resolutional. So, but I'm going to attack some plan. And these ideas sound like a lot like lotteries. In other words, a lump sum of money being given to a person. The Wall Street Journal notes the takeaway is that sudden wealth only exaggerates your current situation. If you're unhappy, bad with money, and surrounded by people you don't trust money with, that will all make these problems worse. The people who need this, the 27% of African Americans in poverty, will be the ones hurt most by the reparations. Economists Hoyt Bleakley and Joseph Ferry noted in the 1832 Georgia land lottery, in which huge, extremely valuable land was randomly handed out to winners. One generation after the distribution of the Georgia land, sons of winners have no better adult outcomes, wealth, income, literacy than the sons of non-winners, and winners. Grandchildren do not have a higher literacy rate or school attendance than non-winners. Grandchildren. In other words, being granted huge amounts of land with extremely large monetary value didn't actually increase the wealth of later generations and had no long-term benefits. Yusuf Nuruddin of New School University notes, if reparation checks arrived on Friday, half of the recipients would be broke by Monday morning. According to the 2012 Vanderbilt study, 70% of lottery winners end up bankrupt. Impact. People who gain some financial windfall, such as the lottery, are not placed on some sort of higher economic platform. Reparations will only increase poverty, not reduce it. Before I jump into my third contention, I do want to talk about, one, your plan that is not resolutional that you've given, though you're trying to not make it a plan or a policy debate. And yeah.
So I'll first refute this idea about the lottery. So there's four main responses to this. Basically, the argument is if we give money, it's just going to be wasted. But I would argue that even so, in your status quo, if you don't give any money, these people are going to maintain their poverty levels anyway. But in Chicago, they tested this theory, and what they saw is when you give money to the people in poorer districts, they were able to move out. And because of the fact that they move into better districts, not only are they provided better educational opportunities, but they're provided better opportunities for themselves and their families, which in turn translated to more income in the long term. But there's four main arguments to the lottery effect, which prove that it doesn't work. First, the notion that Black people can't manage their money and will just irrationally spend it instead of using it as a financial foundation is super emblematic of paternal racism. African Americans can in fact manage money, and for decades they've been proving this. Second is if the lump sums are problematic, then it's easy to make payments spread out over a long period of time and thereby avoid their impacts. In fact, that's how any realistic program would probably work. The government isn't going to pay for everything right at once. Third, there's no evidence points to most lottery winners crashing and burning. They just point out that some do. This is a classic example of erroneous indivicticism. And fourth, this argument isn't applicable to the education and health programs that are often advocated for, and as I advocated for to the youth, as a means of reparations. Because if lump sums are so bad, then any comprehensive reparations program created after study will not take that form. Essentially, their impacts will never materialize. Essentially, what we see is that because educational reparations have never been tested, there's no theory that says they won't work. But what we have seen is that poor income school districts that were given grants on net improve the educational value of their school. And as a result, when your education level improves, you're more likely to receive a job and less likely to be in prison. This goes directly to my turn about the school to prison pipeline. Currently, right now, African American students are the most targeted to end up in prison because they have the highest dropout rate. But the only way to effectively combat the dropout rate, according to Forbes News article, was the fact that when you provide schools with more cash flow, they're able to increase the amount of resources available to students and decrease the amount of dropouts. Preventing dropouts is the only effective way to prevent students from ending up in prison, because students who drop out are far more likely to end up in prison than any other type of student. Furthermore, I'm going to talk about this idea of resolutionality. What we read is that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. As I said in my first case, if I am able to prove that reparations are the making of amends for wrong one is done, then you affirm. Essentially, if I am able to prove to the audience that there was a wrong committed and that reparations would be the effective way to correct this wrong, then you affirm. Whether or not I give an implementation for it doesn't matter, as long as I prove that you all.
So before I jump into my third contention, I'm going to talk about this resolutional analysis. We understand the ought versus the should. As of right now, this is an ought debate. It's more of It's more of a moral debate rather than a should debate, more of a policy debate. I agree with that. But you still have to stay within the parameters of the resolution. And the word is pay. Give someone money that is due for work done, goods received, or debt incurred. This is money. You are not talking about money. Therefore, it's not resolutionally sound. That's the issue that I'm having here. And that's something that you're going to have to address. How are you going to pay? Not make a different welfare system specifically for the African American, because that's not what the resolution is about. Now I'm going to move into my third. So my third, backlash from reparations will hurt African Americans. So I'm going to do a bit of spreading here. According to the Chicago Tribune, rather than advance the cause of equal opportunity for African Americans, the spreading demand for cash compensation is more likely to tip public opinion against the long-term interest rates of most blacks. The Heartland Institute's Joseph Bass notes, governments do not create wealth, they distribute it. They redistribute it. Asking today's government to make up for the mistakes made more than 150 years ago is just another way of saying today's largely white taxpayers owe a debt to black Americans and a burden they apparently bear simply by the virtue of being white. The University of Dayton elaborates, reparations may actually hurt African Americans by engendering a victim status, inducing a backlash from whites. Much of the public opinion problems results from the perception among whites that reparative remedies are reverse discrimination, i.e. that these types of remedies reward African Americans and in most cases other minorities at the expense of whites who feel that they have played no role in oppressing African Americans. It is important to note that it is irrelevant if this is actually true, if only matters that whites feel it is true. Destroy political capital for the other programs that help African Americans like affirmative action, because once the rest of America has made a proper payment for the past wrongs, that would disincentivize continued concessions for things like affirmative action. Impact. Noah Mittleman, senior editor at the American Conservative magazine, notes the push for reparations might well stiffen opposition to other programs designed to address those disparities. Reparations may not lead to reconciliation, but because of the basis for further conflict between agreed groups of citizens, reparations will only increase racial tension. Reparations will make furthering the other racial justice programs harder and isn't worth the backlash. My case impact, reparations will accomplish two things: increasing the African American poverty rate and increasing racial tensions. This is the absolute best case scenario for reparations, and everyone they affect, taxpayers and beneficiaries, is one which all the effects are erased 10 years from now, which would not do anything good for you.
So essentially the problem with the backlash argument is that currently in the status quo, we observe that discourse created by reparations in fact improves African American rights. And this comes back to the fundamental issue that in the last 10 years when reparations have been discussed, there's more legislation going towards improving the societal functions of African Americans. It's black and white in the fact that when we disregard the idea of reparations, we don't create any discourse in society. And Molefi Asante from my second contention tells you that discourse about reparations is the best thing that you can do for African Americans because it increases the amount of legislational push that we have towards it. The second problem with the idea of backlash is the fact that Americans think that in their own current society, there is no racism, but outside of their society, they believe there is racism. The reason why backlash doesn't occur is because the fact that Americans acknowledge that it's a problem, but they aren't willing to address it within their own society. The only way that we can effectively solve for this is by giving the reparations. Then we go into this idea about, you talked about resolutionality, about not talking about money. So even if you want me to provide an implementation, I'll give it to you in a way that provides you directly payment. I would say to African American families, you provide them a direct cash payment that's spread over time that allows them to improve their housing situation. Obviously, I can't tell you how they're going to spend it, and you can come up here and say the lottery effect again. But I would say that giving it to African Americans in segmented periods means that they have financial security and they are able to spend it in ways that would help them. I'm not going to advocate for why they wouldn't spend it in ways that wouldn't help them, but I would say that if you provide African Americans this opportunity, they're able to improve their housing situation, which we improved in Chicago. To American students, because you can't legally give them money and ask them to spend it themselves, I would say to give it directly to the schools as a form of payment, and then these educational payments would go towards improving the resources of the students. But the way that you can look at the affirmative side today and see why you ought to pay reparations, which has never been addressed, is the fact that in current societal situation, the situation for the blacks is far worse than for the whites. Even companies such as Lehman Brothers, Aetna, JP Morgan Chase, and Wachovia have all said that they would be willing to pay reparations and issued formal apologies. This goes to the idea of the US federal government, where you say the American people don't have the moral obligation to pay. I say that American people pay for things that they don't want to do in the status quo anyway. But even if you don't think that the American people should be doing it, I would say American corporations should be the ones paying the government to then give these reparations, because they themselves take the opportunity of being able to pay black people less and being able to provide them with lesser opportunities. So in that regard, the direct ought pay goes directly to American corporations who acknowledges that there's a wrong been committed.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the arguments you made. So one, you talk about racial disadvantage. All right, so there's a huge problem here. A white orphan, a white immigrant escaping the Third Reich, a racial disadvantage is only one of the many kind of disadvantages that can be inherited. Why should it be the one around which we organize ourselves in this debate, that it's somehow a racial discrepancy? You keep saying this term that they do not have equal rights. Well, that's not true. They have equal rights. What they do not have is an equality of outcome. But it is not my job to fix an inequality of outcome. It is not the government's job to fix an inequality of outcome. You do not have the moral proponent there. If there is an inequality of outcome, it is on individuals and their own working progress to get out of it. And then you talked about the precedent. So in both the Holocaust and the Japanese internment payments, therefore, the recipients were the actual victims, or in some cases, the victims' immediate family members. The payments did not go to distant descendants. So something that happened 150 years ago, and you say that now you're going to make, so you're not going to worry about that happened 150 years ago. You're going to worry about the problems that we have in our current society. But like I said, there's no inequality of rights. There's only inequality of outcome. Now, you have not brought a link to why there's an inequality of outcome with respect to needing this. You just stated that there is an inequality of outcome. But I'm not moved by that statement, and I don't think the judges or people who are watching should be moved by that either, because there is no link there. You state twice as many live in poverty, that they're the highest poverty group, but there's also many other groups that have gone through such damaging social and economic problems as the African Americans, and yet they are doing great. Why is it again that we are looking to this racial disadvantage here and not looking at other disadvantages that might be a part of the African American community? Next, you say that the status quo is this and that and this, but right now what the status quo has is the welfare state that has done quite a lot towards helping the African American community. You say that we've stolen $10 trillion in wealth from African American society. I absolutely disagree with that. I don't think that's true, and I think that it would be hard-pressed for an economist to come up with a number that says that. And again, we need to understand the difference between inequality of rights and inequality of outcomes that we have.
All right, so with my final time, I'm going to give the audience the reason why they can vote for the affirmative today. First, you're going to bring up this argument about the idea of rights versus equality. I never said that African Americans don't have equal rights. I said they're not provided equal opportunity. And the reason why this links directly to reparations and directly to the debate today is because, as I brought up in my case, the United States Census Bureau are that Black families are far more likely to live in poverty because of the fact that generations have been discriminated and not provided equal opportunity when buying houses, are not provided the same opportunities in the educational system. And the reason why this occurs is because they lived in poverty before because of slavery, and as generations transcend, they continue to get discriminated. In the famous housing problem in Chicago, we saw that African Americans were denied the same housing as white Americans simply because banks wanted to lend just to white Americans. It's a problem that exists, and I would say that they're not provided equal opportunity. And because these problems these problems roll on each other. When you can't live in the same district as someone, you can't have the same educational opportunities, which then links to my argument about telling you that African-American students who drop out are far more likely to go to prison. And this all catapults from the same idea that because they're discriminated in society today, the reason why JP Morgan, Aetna, Chase have all issued formal apologies is that because United States corporations acknowledge that African Americans aren't granted equal opportunities. But then what you're going to go to the idea of saying is that Japanese Americans were directly provided these reparations. But I believe this argument completely negates your idea of backlash, because when we provided reparations to Native Americans and when we provided reparations to Japanese Americans, there were no substantial backlash that actually caused problems within our country. I would say that we did far more for the Native Americans and far more for the Japanese Americans by providing them these reparations, and I believe that directly turns the backlash argument. But even if you don't buy that, I still tell you that backlash doesn't exist because discourse is created when we talk about reparations. Professor Molefi Asante told you that the reason why that reparation discussion is so important is because discourse is the #1 way to push for legislation to improve the opportunities of African Americans. And that's what's in the debate today, that when we provide these reparations, we're allowing for them to have greater opportunities in current standing American society. Now, the final way in which you can affirm in today's debate is through this idea of implementation. You said that I'm not talking about money, and I tell you that directly paying people to improve their housing situation allows a lot more for African Americans because they improve their educational standing, they're less likely to drop out, they're less likely to go to jail, and they're less likely to be able to create more wealth that continues about generations and generations. But I would also say that the reason why we need to pay reparations is because I prove there has been a wrong and the United States government.
So I'm going to go over my last little bit. I'd like to thank everybody for watching. I'd like to thank him for his arguments. So things I want to go over. One, the lottery winner statement. 70% of lottery winners go broke immediately after. Okay, so let's talk about things that happen. So your plan is not resolutional, so I want the judges to understand that. It's not resolutional. You didn't really give anything. I understand that this is a moral debate, but if you still have to have some plan of action, and you have not. Now, you talked about turning two of my contentions, but that's not true. I've given enough resources to explain how my backlash argument from the impact here will affect racial tensions. And you say that the discourse will lead to more equality of opportunity for the African Americans. Okay, so again, you've given inequality of outcome, but you have not explained how there's an inequality of opportunity or an inequality of rights. There is not. You have not given a single piece of information on how there is an inequality of opportunity. You've just given results, and that is not the same. And again, that would mean that my impact still stands and it's not turned. The next, my first contention, the moral contention. You state that you can somehow make these companies that want to pay the government. Well, these companies will virtue signal and say things that they want, but I haven't seen them actually do it themselves. So why are we to take their word if they're not going to do it without the federal government? And then secondly, we're talking about the federal government, which does imply force, which does imply that there is a moral wrong happening here because you haven't explained how it's morally right for people to do it. And then my second contention, you tried to attack the veracity of the claims about the lottery, but again, you did not sufficiently attack it. I gave you the 2012 Vanderbilt University study. 70% of lottery winners end up bankrupt. I made that absolutely clear. You did not refute that. You gave one case study. I'm giving you the meta-analysis that goes over all of it. So with that being said, you, as the judge, should negate the resolution for my three arguments. One, the moral argument. Two, the negative impact that reparations would increase poverty. And three, my third impact is that the backlash from reparations will hurt African Americans and limit the and limit the other pieces of legislation in a better manner. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody. Well, okay, so it's letting me finish my next 30 seconds. I didn't know if it was going to let me do that. So I'm going to take this next 30 seconds and I'm going to talk about, well, you know what? No, thank you so much. Yeah.